Happy Friday, everybody. James Hancock here, back to review the new flick, The Ritual, which came out on Netflix today. Technically, this movie's been out for a little while. It played the festival circuit and was acquired by Netflix back in September to be released on their platform. As always, I'll be discussing the film in broad general strokes first to avoid any spoilers before getting into any specifics. But before I review the movie, I just want to say I've been noticing a weird thing recently where there are a lot of writers who seem to have an axe to grind with Netflix, and I'm not entirely sure why. I've noticed that with a lot of Netflix movies, especially genre-related Netflix movies, that these shows and movies basically get casually dismissed as if they would have been straight-to-video movies back in the 90s and early 2000s. And perhaps there's something to that, but it seems like a lot of these critics are really hostile to the idea of Netflix becoming successful. But here's my take on it. Anytime you have a company like Netflix that is traveling to film festivals and buying movies, that is a plus for filmmakers. Some would probably counter that it's a mistake to have one giant organization that can basically outbid everybody else and it reduces competition. But I have dabbled in the world of independent movies, and a couple of years ago I helped produce an animated film called Cheatin' with director Bill Plympton, and Netflix was one of the vendors that gave us a platform to distribute the movie. So I think a lot of critics need to revisit some of their assumptions about this threat they seem to perceive Netflix to be. I think it boils down to a lot of people where they resist change in all forms, and they like the traditional model of independent and foreign films playing the festival scene, being acquired, opening in like London and New York and LA, building a little critical momentum before opening up in new markets and on new platforms. And the reality is that way of doing things is just rapidly drawing to a close. If a film or a show is not available to be consumed by people, it just ceases to be a part of the online dialogue of film and movies. So I like the idea of day and date release, whether it's in the theater or on your phone or on your laptop, whatever the case might be, make your shows and movies available to as many people as possible. And with Netflix, you automatically have a built-in audience of 100 million subscribers plus. I'm a bit of a shameless cheerleader for Netflix and what they're doing, but the next time you see critics out there bashing the hell out of a Netflix movie or a Netflix show, just recognize that some of these critics have an agenda where they're basically trying to keep Netflix in their place. In any case, this video is not meant to be an expose on the ongoing battle between the critical community and Netflix. This is a review of The Ritual, so let's discuss it. Without giving anything away, it's basically as if the Blair Witch Project and Deliverance went on a holiday in Sweden with a couple of English lads, got wasted, and had a baby, and that baby is a movie called The Ritual. It does not pretend to be anything more than it is. It is a simple genre story about people going out into the woods, encountering a mystery, and all hell breaks loose, and terrible things start to happen. When assessing the merits or lack thereof in a movie like this, I think the number one concern is, did it scare you? At any point, did you feel anxiety? Did you feel nervous? Did you consider turning it off because you were scared? Did it give you nightmares, etc., and so forth? And I will not go so far as to say that The Ritual is terrifying, but I was alarmed and nervous periodically throughout. Basically, the story takes place over several nights, and during the night is when all the bad things happen. And I was watching it on my iPad, and I felt myself kind of pushing it away at times and kind of clenching my teeth. Sometimes I have a bad habit of biting my tongue when watching scary movies, so I have to kind of lock my face in place to make sure I don't suddenly snap into my tongue when something scary happens. So I definitely was on edge periodically throughout the movie. But there's also this underlying tension as a result of the first scene of the movie, which has nothing to do with the supernatural mystery that is at play in the rest of the film. But basically, they go into a liquor store, and due to the cowardice of the main character, one of their friends is savagely mugged and beaten to death. And as a result, he feels enormous shame and guilt, and a lot of his friends resent him for it. So the question is, throughout the course of this movie, will he be able to rise to the occasion and show enough courage to redeem himself in his eyes and in their eyes, given his cowardice 6 months prior? Now, I would say on the whole, it's a largely effective movie. I do not want to oversell The Ritual, because when it comes to horror movies, there are levels of terror, and there are some movies which just turn your hair white if you have hair, where you never forget that initial fear and anxiety you felt while watching the movie, and there are other horror movies that are just mildly enjoyable, then you kind of put them aside and move on with your life. And I think The Ritual is one of those movies that is pretty enjoyable, but falls short of being a truly harrowing experience. So if you're a sucker for horror movies, if you're a sucker for genre movies, if you're already a subscriber to Netflix, there's absolutely no harm in watching The Ritual. Just recognize that it's not likely to rearrange your current existing top 10 horror list. And speaking of top 10 horror, in honor of this review, I'm wearing my t-shirt for Lucio Fulci's The Beyond, which probably is in my top 10 horror. If you want to see The Beyond, just watch The Beyond, because The Ritual is not going to cut it. In any case, Last spoiler warning, let's talk about some specifics. So let's talk about some of the positives. The movie hits the ground running where you have a couple of friends talking about where they're going to go on holiday. Do they want to go partying in Amsterdam, or do they want to go partying in Vegas? Or since they're getting a little older, do they want to do something healthy like go hiking in Sweden, and so on and so forth. Two of them happen to walk into a liquor store to buy a bottle of vodka, not knowing that some really tweaked out drug addicts are currently robbing the place. The main character, Luke, played by Ray Spall, you'll recognize him from like Shaun of the Dead and Hot Fuzz, as well as Black Mirror. He has an opportunity to hide that his friend does not. And basically, Luke sits there and watches as his friend is beaten to death. And not, to make matters worse, his friend is making eye contact with him as it happens, which only compounds the guilt and shame that Luke feels about his actions. So then we flash forward 6 months where they're on holiday, hiking in Sweden, where one of the friends has an accident where he kind of twists his ankle and like rips his meniscus, which making it very difficult and very painful for him to walk. So they decide that the best thing they can do is take a shortcut to get back to where they came from in order to have a beer, dinner, etc. And the fastest road possible is right through this dark, mysterious forest in the middle of Sweden. I would say the scariest stuff this movie has to offer is during that first night in the woods. They find an abandoned house and they decide to use it for shelter. Inside the house is this strange wooden altar, basically in the form of like a headless deity holding up these antlers almost like hammers. And that night, all four of these friends have really intense but very distinctly different nightmares, which results in them wetting their beds or waking up writhing around in horror. One of them wakes up completely nude, praying to the altar. They are well and properly freaked out, and when they come outside, they start to notice that there are all these runes carved throughout the woods and the trees. But they realize very quickly that there are some locals here that probably belong to some sort of pagan religion or some sort of cult, and the best thing they can do is just get the hell out of there. But as they proceed, they start seeing evidence of sacrifices, like animals impaled up in the branches that are completely disemboweled. And I have to say, the movie does a pretty good job of using sleight of hand to stimulate your imagination. There's a lot of sounds off screen of animals roaring and branches breaking, and your imagination fills in the gaps and imagines something that is potentially even worse than whatever the filmmakers might be able to show you. Although on the other hand, they use that technique so frequently, it doesn't always work equally. And I would say the dialogue is largely okay. It's based on a novel by a guy named Adam Nevill. I have no idea if the novel's a great read or not, if it's based on any existing mythology. But for the most part, the dialogue is functional, but it's not necessarily going to blow anybody away with his originality or his creativity. It's a lot of kind of just dudes cussing at each other and swearing at each other as they become increasingly alarmed and scared. Some of the creepy stuff by far was when you get just a brief glimpse of what might be hunting these characters. I mean, you have all these trees and it's a densely populated forest, and you'll see through all these hundreds and hundreds of trunks what at times almost looks like a giant elk or like a giant deer. I mean, it basically looks like antlers, but obviously it's not an elk or a deer because it's this enormous creature. But when they finally encounter some civilization, they realize that this creature is basically worshipped like a god, and it actually has some supernatural abilities, and that the people who worship it are basically functionally immortal as long as they keep making sacrifices to this thing. I guess if you don't worship it, it's just a monster, but it's basically this strange combination between like a tree trunk and an elk. And the brief glimpses we get in close-up, it is pretty unusual in its appearance, pretty original, kind of unnerving. It's hard to come up with an original monster that doesn't feel derivative from other monsters in other movies. So I don't know if this is the equivalent of like the Loch Ness Monster or Bigfoot for people from Sweden. If so, please tell me. But I was pretty impressed with the look of the creature. And I guess the choice a lot of horror movies have to make at any point is, are you going to allow your characters the ability to fight back? Or is the horror just going to be so overwhelming that it can't possibly be defeated? And in this story, Luke does get a little bit of an opportunity to fight back. When Luke is the only one left and all of his friends have been sacrificed, basically armed with fire and a gun and an axe, he decides he's just going to take this whole place out. And we do get a great creepy scene where he finds this room. It almost looks like a church in a way, but everybody in the pews looks like a combination of like skeletons and like overgrown vines, but they're actually still living and breathing, and they're worshiping yet another one of these wooden creatures. So clearly the immortality promised to the people that are feeding this monster isn't necessarily the kind of immortality that people would hope for. But Luke starts to burn things down. There's a very satisfying moment where this old lady who'd been kind of tormenting him earlier, he just pops her right in the face. And his final confrontation with the monster is kind of interesting and mysterious because the monster keeps encouraging him to lie down, and the monster's almost doing this thing where it's like it's praying to yet another entity that's even more powerful than it, because it keeps kind of like stretching and standing and growing and evolving where you see its entire body, but it almost looks as if it's looking to the heavens praying to something. Luke decides he's had enough, smacks it with an axe, and gets the hell out of there. The ending, sadly, is a little bit underwhelming. He basically runs through the edge of the forest, turns around, kind of goads it a few times, talks a little smack, and the movie ends. And for me, if I'm watching a horror movie, I just want something a little more bleak or something a little more scary. Like if you watch Evil Dead, at the very end, the camera just comes zipping up to Ash, and Ash just screams, and then it cuts to black. Or you watch Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and you have Leatherface just swinging his chainsaw around over and over again, and it's just, it's a shot that you'll never forget. Or even with The Exorcist, the original theatrical cut, not that bullshit extended cut, where you have the priest looking down the stairs while all hell is broken loose the night before, and as he turns back to camera, we just get the title of the film and this terrifying music. I mean, horror movies need to end on a really definitive, killer note to have that maximum impact, and sadly, The Ritual just does not have it. It ends kind of on a whimper and not on a bang. So overall, I enjoyed the movie. I definitely got my money's worth because I got it for free because it was on Netflix. I was nervous, I was alarmed, I just wasn't terrified. So I'd say I enjoyed it, I just wasn't blown away by it. But if that endorsement isn't strong enough, you can always check out Lucio Fulci's classic horror film, The Beyond. In any case, I hope you found this video useful. Please consider giving my channel a subscribe. I would really appreciate it. If you want to talk more, give me a shout in the comments below or give me a shout on Twitter @Colbrax. And I hope everyone has an amazing weekend. Talk to y'all soon.